According to a Greek legend, in ancient Athens, a man noticed the great philosopher Aesop playing some children's games with a group of boys. He laughed and jeered at Aesop, asking him why he wasted his time with such a frivolous activity. Aesop responded by picking up a bow and loosening the string on it and laying it on the ground. And he said to the man, "Do you know what this illustrates?" The man thought about it for a moment, and he confessed that he didn't know what Aesop meant by the unstrung bow. Aesop explained to him, if the bow remains under tension at all times, it loses its power, and then it can't do what it was designed to do. But by relaxing the string and then stringing it again when you need to use it, the bow remains strong. There's a purpose for rest. There is a purpose, and the Lord wants us to know that. As Jesus' disciples came back from the mission field, Jesus could see they were weary, and so he invites them to find their rest. Our text this morning is Mark chapter 6, verses 30 through 32, and there we find this passage. The apostles gathered together with Jesus, and they reported to him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a secluded place and rest a while." For there were many people coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. They went away in the boat to a secluded place by themselves. Now, as we consider that text this morning, I want you to first of all think of this. The work is essential. At the time of this event recorded in our text, Jesus was in the midst of his 3-year ministry. Think about that for just a moment. Jesus came to this earth with a heavenly mission to impart to the world, to turn the world upside down, and he had 3 years in his earthly ministry to accomplish that purpose. 3 years to do everything that God intended for him to do. God had chosen this specific window of time to announce his new covenant with man, to establish the gospel message, and to prepare for the foundation of the church, the kingdom of God that would be established through the ministry of Jesus. And all of that had to be done in 3 years. The whole group of God's people was waiting for the promised Messiah who would come and establish the eternal kingdom. But there was only 3 years to prepare for it. So much to do, and so little time to do it in. And so there was an urgency to do the work while it could be done. I want to tell you that we might not be living in Bible times. We might not be walking with Jesus physically here upon this earth. But there is an urgency to our time as well. You know, when I was very young, life seemed to stretch on forever. A person being in their 60s, wow, think about how long they had been here. And here I am, 66, and it seems like, how did I get here so fast? You know, time is just consumed by our lives so quickly that instead of looking forward after a while, we're looking back and thinking, how did I get here? I'm still 20. No, but the time's caught up with me that way. Life is short. And all that God has designed for us to do in our lives can be done for this brief time only. I want you to think about that. All the work that we have to do for his kingdom, all the ministry that we have to perform for our Lord can only be done in this world. It can only be done for this little time. And then for eternity, our time is over. Then we enter into his rest. And so there needs to be an urgency about that work. We have so much to do and so little time. And all of us have work to do. I know there's been this idea that's gone through the church of a clergy laity system where a few people are selected out to do the work of the church and everybody else is just sort of audience, where everybody else just sort of sits back and relaxes and doesn't do much of anything. That's not God's design for the church. He designed a priesthood of all believers. He designed an every member ministry. He designed you not for relaxation, not for retreat. But God has a design for your life, and he has a work for you to do. I can't tell you what the work he has assigned you, created you for. But you have a purpose in your life. Your life is not meaningless. Each of us is designed differently. Each of us is infinitely unique from everyone else. And so God's purpose in our lives is different. C.S. Lewis once wrote, "The work of a Beethoven and the work of a charwoman become spiritual on precisely the same condition, that of being offered to God, of being humbly done as to the Lord. This does not, of course, mean that it is for anyone a mere toss-up of whether he should sweep rooms or compose symphonies. A mole must dig to the glory of God, and a cock must crow." C.S. Lewis is saying, God didn't make us the same. God has different things in mind for us. But we all have a purpose that God made us to do. And so, since we have so much to get done and so little time, we need to see the essential nature of work. But then our passage reminds us of the second thing I'd like you to address this morning, and that is that rest is also essential. There will always be work to do, but we can't stay constantly at work. The hardest thing about milking cows, the dairy farmer said, is that they just need milked again. It doesn't stay done. No matter how much work we have to do, there's always more work to do. And if we wait for a break in the work before we rest, then we're never going to rest. But that's not good for us to constantly work. Our physical bodies have real limits, and we need to recognize that. If we don't rest, we will become incapable of doing that important work that God's called us to do. Now, Jesus is a great illustration of this. Jesus, before he came to this earth, was spirit in nature. God is spirit. He didn't tire. He didn't wear out. There is no task that he took on that exhausted him. But when Jesus came to this world, he became fully man as well as fully God. He put on human flesh, and just like us, he was subject to its limits. And what do we see when Jesus is involved in his ministry? There were times when the work became too much for him, and he needed to retreat. He needed to pull away. He needed to get to a quiet place where he could spend time in prayer with his Father and recharge the batteries to get his physical body able to do the work again. Jesus saw the need for rest. None of us is immune to it. All of us find that in this world we have things which consume us physically, and we need to be able to get to that place where we can be refreshed. When Jesus was in the Jerusalem area, he had a special retreat in a place called the Garden of Gethsemane, a quiet place located just outside of town where he could go and not be pressed in by the crowds. And there in that quiet place, he could seek the presence of his Father. He could come away from all the chaos and the work of his ministry to recharge himself again. If even our Lord needed to rest, how can we think that we don't? And I want to remind you of this morning. Our rest is not just to escape our work. It enables us to work better. One man challenged another man to a wood chopping contest. He said that in one day's time he could chop more wood than this other experienced woodsman could. And so on the set day, at the set time, they began. They began chopping as much as they could. Now, this challenger noticed that his opponent kept taking breaks. The challenger only rested for a few moments at lunch, and the rest of the day he was hard at the work. But he kept looking over at the challenger and seeing that he was resting again. And come the end of the day, he was sure that he had won the contest. But he didn't even come close to the amount that the other man had done. And he said to him, "How is it possible when every time I looked over your way, you were resting, that you got more wood chopped?" And the man said, "You didn't seem to notice that every time I rested, I sharpened my axe." That's what rest is about. Rest is sharpening ourselves to be able to do the work more efficiently. If we kept at the work and we didn't take our rest, we would become dull. We would become unable to accomplish what the Lord wants to accomplish through our lives. By taking rest, we become able again to do what the Lord wants us to do in our lives. And that's why God has always insisted that his followers take time to rest. He made us, and he knows us better than we know ourselves. He knows us down to every molecule in our being. He knows how we're constructed. He knows his design in us. And therefore, he's always allowed for rest for his people. There is a purpose for rest. Just one other thing I want you to see this morning. And that is that while rest is essential, it's only as we observe work and rest in the proper order that rest becomes what God intended. Notice the context for Jesus calling his disciples to retreat and rest. They had just finished their mission work that he had sent them out into the villages to proclaim the good news, to proclaim the message that he had come. He sent them out to do the work, and they had gone into those communities, and they had preached, and they had worked hard at the tasks that Jesus gave them, and now they had come back to Jesus with their report, and they're weary from their work. What's more, while they were under constant demand in the work, when they came back, there was no provision for rest for them. Notice what our text says. There were many people coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. How are you going to get rested when you're still in constant demand? And so Jesus ordered them to find a secluded place, to go across the lake to the other side, so that they could get away from the demands and they could rest. That is the order that Jesus intends for our lives. First the work, then the rest. The work we do is followed by the rest that we need. We have too many Christians today who have it backwards. Somehow they think that they're to stay in perpetual rest, and occasionally, when they feel motivated, they might do a little work. But the vast majority of their time, they stay away from the Lord's work. The work must be a priority, and the rest is to recover, that more work can be done. Now, that may sound laborious. That may sound enslaving to you, but it's not. When we're about the Lord's work, that's our highest purpose. That's the fulfillment of our design. That's where we find greatest satisfaction. That's where we find joy in living. It's not something which is drudgery. It's not something which is duty. It is not something which is to be avoided. It is our purpose in the world. And we carry out what God designed us to do. We're going to find our lives full and complete and satisfying. But God didn't call us to leisure. We deny the very meaning of our lives if we seek to do little or nothing. Our culture around us calls us to devote ourselves to recreation and to seek entertainment. But that's the lifestyle of the useless and the meaningless. You can eat up your whole life being entertained and seeking recreation and not accomplish any of the good God designed for you. God has a higher opinion of your life than the world around you does. God sees the potential that you can accomplish, the great good that can only come out of your life. Rest is essential, but it's not the purpose of our lives. And we must be devoted to the work and take our rest from the work as needed. In 1921, there was a Scandinavian couple by the name of David and Svea Flood who went to Africa. In 1921, Africa was still very primitive. There were a lot of regions that were very remote and hardly had any contact with the outside world. And they were determined to take their lives and to live it for God's purpose there. They met up with another Scandinavian mission couple, the Ericsons. And there they prayed and plotted out their work. They decided to focus on one little remote community, a little village there, that they were going to take the gospel to. But when they went to that little village, the chief there didn't want to let them in. He thought that their message proclaiming another God besides the ones that the villagers worshiped would anger their gods. So he told them that they could not live in their village. They could not work in that village. So they instead built 2 huts farther up the hill from that little village. Now the chief did allow a boy to go to them every week to sell them chickens and eggs, and that's what they lived on for a while. And they felt so frustrated in their ministry because they weren't allowed to share the gospel that they'd come to share. And then Svea Flood decided if their only mission field was the young boy bringing them eggs and chickens every week, she would bring the gospel to that one boy. And so every week she spoke to that boy about Jesus until he became a believer. Not long after that, Svea became pregnant. And at the end of that pregnancy, the chief relented to have a midwife come and assist her with the birth. But Svea already had been through a serious case of malaria, and she was weak. And 17 days after she gave birth to their baby girl, she died. She died and was buried in a little grave with a white cross marking it, and her name carved upon that cross. And David's heart was broken. Suddenly he found himself without his life's companion, with a work that had gone nowhere. And he felt like he had poured himself out for the Lord, and the Lord had abandoned him. He was so mad at God. He not only left the mission field, but he left his faith in God as well. He left his little girl behind with the Ericsons for them to raise her, because he just wanted to get rid of everything that he had been doing before. Unfortunately, a few months after this, both the Ericsons contracted a fever, and they died. Another American missionary took over the care of the little girl, the girl that had been named Ania, they changed her name to Aggie. And when they moved back to the United States, they brought her with them. Aggie grew up strong in the faith. She married a young man, Dewey Burst, who was also strong in the faith. Soon they had started a ministry in the local church, and as he grew and became known for his impressive teaching, he was called to lead the Christian college in the Seattle area. And it was there in Seattle that someone, for some reason, put a Christian publication from Scandinavia into their mailbox. Now, Angie couldn't read a word of what was there. But as she flipped through the pages, she came to a picture from Africa of a grave with a white cross with her mother's name carved on it. And instantly she had to know what the article said. She took it to a professor at the college who was able to speak a number of languages, and he was able to translate for her. The article talked about the revival that was going on in the country that they had left there, because this woman had converted one boy. And he, when he grew up, got permission from the chief that was opposed to the Christian faith to open up a school in the village. And there, working with the kids, he converted every one of them to Christ. And they converted their parents. And even eventually the chief was converted to, when the article was published, 600 people in that village were following Christ because of the message to one boy. Angie went to find her father then. Found him towards the end of his life. He was bedfast. His bed was surrounded by alcohol bottles. His newer children warned her that he would not tolerate anything said about God. But she came to him and introduced herself as his daughter. And he was glad to see her until she brought up how good God had been to them. Then he turned his back to her and faced the wall and said he was not going to talk anything about God because God had robbed him of everything good in his life. And so with his back turned to her, she began to tell him about that one boy that his wife had converted, and about a whole village that had been turned around because of it. And she said, "Your work for the Lord was not in vain. My mother did not die in vain. God's purpose was there through your work. You just failed to see it." Brothers and sisters, we don't know if we're going to be able to recognize God's hand in the work that we've been given to do. But if we're faithful to be about that work, and if we rest instead of becoming discouraged and giving up in our lives, if we rest from time to time to be renewed for that purpose, God can accomplish great things to come out of our lives as well. God created you to have a meaningful life. And that life in this world requires rest from time to time. But we are to live on purpose and for a purpose. Our work here only has meaning as it's done for God and by his power. And therefore, the most important decision we make is to live for the Lord in our lives.